here on this sunny, cool morning. Some of you may not realize this because in these classes I have been attached to this podium. Normally when I teach, I walk around, but it doesn't work very well for the camera person. It can be just totally disoriented, right? So if you wonder if I'm so feeble and frail that I have to have this to hold myself up, that's probably not the case. I'm trying to make this work for those who are trying to film and may want to watch this online. Last week, we spent much of our time dealing with Greg Locke and the Global Vision Bible Church. And one of the things that came out of that was that Greg Locke was not somebody totally unself-reflective. He was, however, somebody who realized, as Tim Alberta says, that there's a market for the irrational. There is a market for wingnut religion, and he was willing, as a business model, to provide for that. And that has seeped into, more broadly, the evangelical church, where pastors are no longer there just to minister to congregations, but are to be public personalities. Then we made the transition from Greg Locke to the Orthodox monk Cyril Hoveren, who in the day was an assistant to the Russian patriarch and served in that role, but was largely a teacher. So I'm going to just review a little bit of that because we broke midstream here on this. And then we will move to, in the same chapter, to this very serious scholar, Miroslav Volf, who is the director of the Yale University Center on Religion and Culture. He is Croatian by birth, and he often goes back to one of the Croatian islands to work in the summer. Not a bad place to go, I guess. And he grew up in a very conservative religious environment, not only in Croatia, but in Serbia. His father in Novi Sad, which is a kind of, it's about an hour or two out of Belgrade, and a beautiful place on the Danube River, and his father was a Pentecostal preacher. So he has deep roots in conservative Christianity, but studied in this country and in Germany with some really fine theological thinkers. And he himself is a very fine thinker. And we're going to see how Tim Alberta makes all this fit together. As I mentioned last time, Tim Alberta says with regard to the Russian Orthodox Church, that fortunately for the Kremlin, doctrinal conviction is not a precondition for religious tribalism. And as the historian Marek Kozlowski has stated, Orthodox Christian nationalism has been on the rise ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And those of us who have traveled and visited Russia know how the Russian Orthodox Church, and I use this euphemistically, has been baptized by the state. And money has flowed in abundance. into the restoration of these churches. Now, from an artistic and art history point of view, this is marvelous. These places are stunning. It didn't happen because people were giving their own individual contributions to the church. The state was putting money in. To Hoveron, Cyril Hoveron, Tim Alberta says, the Kremlin strategy seemed clear. The Russian government, the Patriarch, and the Russian Orthodox Church would join forces. They would partner to create a spiritual rationale for the policies of the Kremlin, some of which were very unpopular. Okay. Once Russia invaded Ukraine full bore, Patriarch Kirill was clearly operating in tandem with Vladimir Putin. Any pretense of church independence was long gone. The church provided the Russian state and Vladimir Putin with the language of divine destiny to underwrite Mother Russia's historical and religious right to retake what it considered its own. Long gone was the Soviet Union's attempt to relegate church to the dustbin of history. Now its goal was to co-opt the church. Vladimir Putin has known and does know what he's doing. Okay. I don't think I read this last time. I quote Tim Alberta. When you have a special mission from God, you are not bound by moral norms. Hoveron said, you are free. And this was taking place in France at a conference where Tim Alberta attended, and Hoveron and Miroslav Volf were both there. Hoveron said, you are free to do whatever your mission requires you to do because the moral baseline is gone. Hoveron was quick to clarify something. Putin is not really a religious man. The Russian leader practices an eclectic kind of theology, he said. He cherry picks whatever spiritual concept supports his ideological agenda. The one constant in all of this, the one thing Putin believes in, is power. By weaponizing religion, Hoveron said, Putin had accumulated more of it than ever before. Russia wasn't merely using Christianity to endorse its ambitions. Russia was using Christianity to define its enemies. And one of the great ironies in this, of course, if you know anything about Russian church history or Ukrainian church history, the Russian Orthodox Church has been joined in many ways, but at the hip with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And that has created tension in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Church has tended to want to separate itself from the Russian Orthodox Church, is to define its enemies. It was the kind of identitarian programming that presaged some of history's greatest crimes. And in the case of Russia's butchery in Ukraine, it would not have been possible without the blessing of the church. Now that's a horrific kind of image and prospect. Now, sharing the dais at this conference in France, with Hoveron was, as I said, this Croatian, come Serbian, come American theologian Miroslav Volf. Miroslav, M-I-R-O, Slav, S-L-A-V. Volf is spelled with a V, not a W, as Germans might say. It's V-O-L-F. As Tim Alberta reports in his book, the conversation at the conference in France was between two European scholars, but the subtext was clearly the American evangelical church. Quote, Hoveron fought a smirk. He fought a smirk while describing how Putin manipulated his countrymen into buying a revisionist founding myth of their nation. His ultimate goal was to make Russia great again. End quote. Now, that doesn't sound familiar to any of us. For his part, Volf detailed the ways religion and nationalism were motivating totalitarian movements in many parts of the world today. Religion and nationalism. He said that during his time, Volf that is, his time teaching American Christians in America, things had changed. He's been in this country for a long time now. A generation earlier, he said, in his early time teaching American students in this country, a militant approach to theology was largely below the surface. But now, the American church, broadly speaking, has been captured by nationalist ideals that saturate the evangelical ecosystem. This Christian nationalism was now, according to Volf, the predominant form of evangelical Christianity. Ponder that for a moment. Now, he comes out of that kind of evangelical tradition, not American initially, but he studied in Southern California at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is really quite conservative. Academically respected, but really quite theologically conservative. According to Alberta, Volf conceded he had no idea what to do about that. This ecosystem, he said, is so insular, it's almost impenetrable by outside and contrary realities. Think of certain media outlets, and there's more than one, there are many. And evangelical leaders have too often ceased to be educated, thoughtful leaders and have instead become media personalities. Again, I read from Tim Alberta. And here he's reflecting Miroslav Volf. But he's speaking about himself. In recent years, I had spoken with missionaries and evangelists spanning multiple continents, and they all shared the same fundamental concern. Was all this nationalistic talk from the American evangelical church just talk? Or was it indicative of a serious effort to restructure the relationship between the state and the country's dominant Protestant religion. And if it was the latter, why weren't sane Christians doing more to stop it? He says the last question haunted me most. In the years following September 11th, as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, ISIS slaughtered innocents in the name of Allah, Western intellectuals fixated on the idea of finding and elevating moderate Muslims who could help reclaim the religion from its violent extremist fringe. The wisdom and efficacy of this strategy was dubious, he says, yet it struck me that Christianity was probably overdue for the same conversation. Globally in Russia and in the United States, this was not to equate suicide bombers with January 6th rioters or to compare body counts between Putin and Osama bin Laden, but rather to observe, he says, that there are consequences when religious doctrines become infected with political ideology. While the scope of the American crisis at present seemed trivial relative to, say, the Crusades, things had gotten very bad very quickly and would only get worse unless something was done about it. I got a email this past week from a Jewish friend in the Midwest who just put a link, and he just signs his name. That's all he often does. Please read this. And it was interesting in that there have been those in this country with regard to our merging of political ideology and religion who see it, who describe it as a virus that has infected the system. The author of this says, I don't think so. I think it's an autoimmune response, where those of us who think we're not part of that world, our autoimmune system is feeding on ourselves. I've never thought of it quite that way, but he may be right. Okay. Hoveron was asked, according to Alberta, at this conference, whether both Putin's Russia and in Trumpism we are dealing with secular religion. And here he makes a distinction. He says, Hoveron replied, yes, we are dealing with a similar kind of secular religion. But here he wanted to distinguish between civil religion and political religion. Civil religion has been around in America for a long time. When I first started seriously studying these things, out of California, there was a lot of work being done about how our religion in this country had become civil religion in many ways. Hoveron says, civil religion is practiced voluntarily, whereas political religion is imposed by the state and is not optional. There you go. He sees in Russia political religion. In the United States, he claims, we are still at the civil religion stage, whereas Russia, things have moved to the political stage under Putin. However, he thinks the United States is not immune from moving to the political religious stage. In Trumpism, we are dealing with civil religion, a form of civil religion. It's not yet political religion. Could this happen in the USA? I still believe it is possible, unfortunately. Now, that's not a prediction on his part? Larry.
I have read that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is a Christian nationalist.
Yes, I have encountered that as well. And I don't know who put it out there, but there is, yes, that Pete Hegseth is a Christian nationalist, the new Secretary of Defense. I saw a picture of him on a beach, without a shirt on. He's got tattoos all over, some of which were clearly Christian nationalist. And apparently, when he was on active duty, he was turned in by fellow soldiers because it is illegal to have tattoos of Christian nationalist themes. Well, for whatever reasons, now he is where he is. Okay. India.
How does he define civil versus political? Because civil to me seems like, they say a prayer at the beginning of.
Yeah.
But political to me is deciding for everybody how you're supposed to handle abortion, for example.
Yeah.
That's not going
What's the difference between civil religion and political religion? I mean, we, as India says, we have clergy present and offer prayers at various civil and political events, and it all seems kind of innocuous, I suppose, on some level. But then, of course, we have a prayer service for an incoming president, and an Episcopal archbishop who doesn't quite play by the rules. The expectations.
Play by Christian rules.
Go, girl, you go. Yeah. And if you have not yet seen it, or seen them, you may want to try to get a hold of Liz Eaton's written statement. Very strong. You may want to get a hold of the statement produced by the 6 regional ELCA bishops. Very strong.
find it on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah.
Along the political civil line, the prayer at inauguration, and I didn't see the inauguration, I just read, typical prayer, a civil act of a prayer at inauguration. But, and I don't remember the exact language, but literally it was, God saved, you are here by God's, because God specifically saved you, and,
Yeah.
I mean, literally it's a coronation by divine right almost.
Yes. Okay. At this inauguration, and I think at every inauguration, the incoming president or his people so far decide who's going to give that prayer. And this one seemed to be almost messianic, you're saying, in terms of it must be messianic. He must be endorsed by the Lord because he survived an assassination attempt.
Can you say who it was? Because I didn't watch it.
I didn't watch it either. I don't. Huh? Oh yeah. Franklin Graham. Yeah. He is. Well, we won't go there. What I would like to do is conclude this section on Miroslav Volf and Hoveron, again with some readings from Tim Alberto, because he captures this, and you get an insight into Miroslav Volf. I think that is really quite interesting. Alberto writes, to the extent Hoveron remained optimistic, it was because of a basic difference between American evangelicalism and the Russian Orthodoxy. In India, your question about civil religion versus political religion is out here. Political evangelicalism, at least rhetorically, is Christ-centric, he said. At least political evangelicalism in America is Christ-centric. If you take Putin or others, they don't speak about Christ. They speak about things in the faith. And Wolf wasn't sure that the rhetoric mattered anymore. Here, Alberta quotes Wolf. I have come to believe that the Christ of the gospel has become a moral stranger to us. And if you read the Gospels, the things that profoundly mattered to Christ, they marginally matter to most evangelical Christians. And the things that really profoundly mattered to them marginally mattered to Christ. He added, in the sense in which Christ is the key to Christianity, you cannot have Christianity without Christ. We are, in a certain sense, in this crisis of Christianity precisely because of a certain alienation from Christ. One of the journalists asked Wolf to be more specific. Could he offer some examples of the things that mattered profoundly to Christ? The professor's eyes danced at this open-ended invitation to proselytize. I assume the question wasn't planted. Christ concerned himself greatly, says Wolf, with the poor. But the poor are hardly mentioned in today's evangelical discourse. Christ actively avoided fame, asking the people on whom he performed miracles not to tell anyone. But today's evangelical leaders are drunk on fame. Christ demanded that we love our enemies. But not even lip service is being paid to this in today's evangelical churches. Now here's a guy who comes out of that general world, and he spends a lot of time out there in it, studying it, thinking about it. I could go down the line of fundamental values of modernity, the fundamental values most of us, and contrast them to what one finds in the gospel. You find incredible discrepancy, the professor concluded, and I find it deeply disturbing. Now, if you think he's overgeneralizing, fine, about American Christianity, but this dude has done his homework. He knows. He is making a point. And from his point of view, he does not think he's hyperbolic. Okay. We are alienated from Christ. Paul Tillich, maybe we're alienated from Christ, but we may be alienated from God too. Paul Tillich, in the 1950s, was one of those great public intellectuals in the United States, taught in New York, came from Germany, along with Reinhold Niebuhr, an American. I've gone back and read his, worked with his book, which is still relevant, Moral Man and Immoral Society. It is a classic. Barack Obama put it on top of his reading list. And the assumption is that the argument is, from Tillich, that we're all theists. The only question is, who or what is our God? It could be money, anything you value and are willing to go to the mat on for is your God. It may or may not be the God of the Bible. But don't think we've just opted out of any theological frame of reference. He doesn't buy that. Reinhold Niebuhr, which interestingly enough, one of the producers of a Reinhold Niebuhr DVD is a gentleman whose mother attended church here. She's moved and she's going to another church. His dad was an ELCA pastor, a classmate of ours at PLU. And Reinhold Niebuhr said, in a kind of realism, individuals can be and ought to be moral. Societies can't be. They're governed by power. Whether you agree with that or not, it's an interesting proposition that for societies to function and have some sense of unity, power is going to be exercised, and it may not always be good. And so we're caught in this quandary. And for those of us who claim to be Christian, removing the biblical God and Christ to the margins can happen very slowly and subtly if we're not careful. Larry.
In defense of power, I would say that LBJ, in his getting the civil rights laws passed in 64 and 65, used his power for good to get that passed.
Yes. Larry is saying, in defense of power, LBJ could exercise power in dramatic ways for good. Think of the civil rights. He was probably repugnant in a lot of ways, personally, but he knew how to use power. That strikes a note for me. I remember when I was at seminary, probably second year, and I was in a Christian ethics class, and I wrote a paper on almost precisely that thing. Let's get over this notion that power isn't in play. The only question is how we're going to use it. And that is what has to be then reflected upon and shaped, hopefully, for values that represent, in our case, Judeo-Christian values. Or, if not for religious reasons, noble values, humanitarian values.
So it seems to me that Bishop Buddy Tuesday used her power in a very opportune way, and that we must, as a church, not we must be savvy about power and the way that it corrupts, but we also must use our power and our voice to be countercultural and to form resistance.
For those of you who don't know, this is my wife. Yes. To be countercultural, we need to use our power in, shall we say, good and right ways. But use it.
This soft-spoken, quiet bishop of Washington, D.C. stood there in the most calm of ways, shaking inside, as we all would be. But she did not back off from the voice of the church and what it is that we are about.
I agree. Well, we're still married after 50 years or whatever. So we probably do agree on a few things anyway. Now, let me just be a little closer to home. I think you saw, you witnessed, and heard some of that same thing going on in worship today here. I think. Richard?
Talk about power and how it can be used for good or evil. There are also sort of two attributes of power, as to whether it's the power of compulsion, where people are forced to do something, or the power of cooperation, where people agree to do something.
Yeah. I think that's a good distinction and a good point. The power of compulsion versus the power of cooperation. You know, power is going to be exercised. Now, how? Not only the ends, but how is it going to be exercised? Is it going to be for the sake of enlisting cooperation? Or just beating us with a stick into line? Now, I think that may come back to your point earlier, India, about the difference between civil religion and political religion. Most of us, if our skin is light enough, and we seem American enough, probably are not going to get killed. But we're in a society where not everybody is in our privileged position. So there's stuff to think about here. Now, I am getting to a point where I have a little agenda anxiety too. I'm gonna switch gears here and bring us to Brian Zond. And I've titled this section, "The Courage to Push Back." As you realized, and I've told you and before, I have selected certain sections out of Brian Zond's book. Brian Zond is a really interesting case in point. And you could come to the conclusion, given what we've done so far, that all of American evangelicalism is on the crazy side of things. Tim Alberta, however, relates many stories about people who've tried to, in the evangelical church, have tried to push back. Some at great cost to themselves. I think Jimmy Carter pushed back. He didn't care if he got pushed back for what he said. Brian Zond is another interesting case. Now this Brian Zond is in his mid-60s, and as a teenager he had attended at Missouri Western State University a revival, and he had a life-changing experience with Christ at that revival. And as a result, he became what he self-describes today as a Jesus freak. Now that language is a little dated, but it was pretty relevant in the day. He was part of the charismatic renewal in the early 60s and immediately began to engage in the so-called gifts of the Spirit and to proselytize. And we might add, with according to Tim Alberta's description, quite successfully. He started a ministry called the Catacombs. I think this was in Kansas City, which, as Alberta describes it, was part music venue, part coffee house, part the headquarters for the young people of the Jesus movement in the whole Kansas City area. And in 1981, the Catacombs morphed into an actual church called the Word of Life. It quickly became a sensation. It attracted loads of college kids, young professionals, people generally disaffected with more traditional churches and religious expressions. Zahn, then 22 years of age, appointed himself the lead pastor. Here we go. Even though he had no formal theological education. Zippo. But he was off and running. The church moved venues, upsized, and eventually built this massive, state-of-the-art sanctuary. Word of Life clearly was a mega church, and as such, its influence spread far and wide. Attendance exploded, according to Alberta, and by all external, objective measures, it was a success in contemporary American terms. It had people, it had money, and it had power. But as Tim Alberta tells it, Brian Zahn gradually began to feel that something was wrong. Again, maybe a bit of an extended excerpt from Alberta's book. Around the turn of the century, Zahn began to sense that something wasn't right. His church was full of really nice people. They had grown up together, if not literally, then by association, from subversive teenage zealots to refined middle-aged church folk, but they hadn't grown spiritually. Theirs was a Christianity, Zahn began to realize, so heavy on style and feeling and expression that it eschewed doctrinal substance. In this sense, they became every bit as complacent and as consumeristic as the churches they had once rebelled against. There wasn't anything countercultural. There wasn't anything countercultural about what they were doing. This was the culture. Just a few Bible verses being drizzled over it. Zahn said, we started off as radical Jesus freaks, but over time we turned into a bunch of Republicans with Jesus fishes on our SUVs. It all began to feel facile and thin. Zahn never had been insecure about his lack of theological training, but it now gnawed at him. He would come home after Sunday afternoons feeling strangely unfulfilled, like a man leaving a banquet with his stomach still rumbling. I had a crisis of faith, but it wasn't about Christ. It was about Christianity, American Christianity, the pastor recalled. I just came to the conclusion that Jesus deserves a better Christianity than this, and I needed to go looking for it. Zahn had no idea where to start. He, by then in his mid-40s, had spent his entire adult life stuck in the cul-de-sac of charismatic Christianity where everyone reads the same stuff and it's very insular. After stumbling for a while, Zahn finally discovered the church fathers, and quote unquote, we call them the patristics, the church fathers, okay? There were women too, but you know how it went. The church fathers, these were the experts who helped establish Christian doctrine in the ancient church. Augustine of Hippo, Gregory of Nyssa, Irenaeus of Lyon, Maximus the Confessor, known in academic settings as the patristics. These men merged Christian philosophy with applied theology, furnishing Zahn with an intellectual understanding of Christ he never knew existed. It was thrilling. I had been embarrassingly ignorant of this stuff, he says, and I couldn't get enough of it. I found this thread. After studying all the church fathers, now I started to read N.T. Wright and Walter Brueggemann and Stanley Hauerwas and David Bentley, Hart, and all these preeminent theologians. I am learning and changing, and I'm loving every second of it. Those names, I mean, the ancient names you may recognize. Tom Wright, British New Testament scholar. He had just finished his degree when I started graduate school. Walter Brueggemann, great Old Testament theologian, scholar. India knows about Walter Brueggemann. Still producing stuff. He must be in his 90s now. Stanley Hauerwas, Bentley Hart, and so on. Skipping on. The following Sunday, and on the Sundays that followed, Zahn made clear, Tim Alberta had visited the church, clear to his congregation what the new Word Life Church would be about. He went before his congregation. I began to critique the American empire as not a kind of biblical Israel, but a kind of biblical Babylon. Uh-oh. I told them that God was not on our side, that God raised up Jesus, not America. The pastor recalled, I was pretty direct about it. You didn't have to read between the lines anymore. They got it and they left. They got it and they left. It was a slow leak at first, a Sunday no-show here, a Bible study absence there, and then a gusher. Entire cliques and social networks quit the church together. Quit the church together. People defected by the dozens, and then by the hundreds. Within a few years, Zahn's announcement, the church had lost more than 1,500 members. The pastor was prepared for casualties, but he couldn't have predicted the scale of the exodus. Looking back, the hardest part was overhearing all the accusatory whispers about how he'd succumbed to a weakened, watered-down Christianity when precisely the opposite was true. They would say, Brian's backsliding. If anything, I was front-sliding. He said laughingly, suddenly, I'm more committed to Jesus than I've ever been. But they saw it differently, because when you're stuck in the right or the left-right paradigm, that's all you can see. They would say, Brian's become a Democrat. But I'm not a Democrat, I'm a kingdom person. Okay. It's an interesting story amongst all of these other things that we see here. Tim Alberta describes coming into the parking lot on a Sunday morning, and it's huge, and there's a smattering of cars. And he kind of checked his schedule, checked how many services do they have. Maybe this is a small service. He said this was it, the only one. And he went into this 1,000-seat, 1,500-seat auditorium, and there may have been 150 people. The portrait of Brian Zahn, presented by Tim Alberta, is of a man clear-eyed about what has happened to him and his church, but totally at peace about the changes he has made. He doesn't appear to be a man, says Alberta, who has second thoughts, but a man secure. Are we okay? No, you're fine. You are fine. He doesn't appear to be a man with second thoughts, but a man secure in the power of Christ and his kingdom. Long gone, however, he says, was the preaching designed to whip the congregation into a frenzy against perceived enemies of Christianity who are out to destroy America. What does perplex him is that so many can't see the disservice that is being done to Christ and the gospel. Many of us, I suspect, in this room, might say amen to that. Hopefully, I would think, without becoming smug or blind to our own misplaced forms of counterculturalism. As I've said before, I personally, and I think probably many of you may agree, the church ought to be countercultural. But that begs the question, what are we countercultural about? It's one thing to stand up and be countercultural, but we have to think long and hard, not only how we're going to be countercultural, but what is it we want to resist? Whether it's our consumeristic culture, whether it's America fighting wars it may not have to fight, it chooses to fight. We could go on down the list. See if I can finish this before. Well, maybe we can. Again, from Tim Alberta. Looking back, this is reported by Alberta, Zahn is grateful for losing much of his congregation. And that had happened many years before. Downsizing so dramatically allowed the pastor to connect with his people more intimately, to make sure everyone was on board with his mission and his message. This is not only made for a healthier church, it has insulated the word of life from the turmoil of the Trump era. In fact, Zahn told me at the moment, with many of his clergy counterparts were bleeding members from their churches. Word of Life was experiencing, at this point, real growth, and had done so for over a decade now. Continuing on. Many people come to him, and he talks about worshiping online during the pandemic, and he said it was necessary to do. It's not sufficient. He says, there are people who have been worshiping online with them. And so he inquires about this. And he says, many of these people just can't find a healthy, sane church to go to. These people feel like they have nowhere to go. I just heard from someone yesterday who lives in Texas. He's in Missouri. Apparently, the county she lives in voted for Trump in a higher percentage in 2020 than any other county in America. And she told me, Pastor, I can't find a normal church. What do I say to that? He says, Zond is happy on some interim basis to offer an online community to the displaced masses. But it's not a sustainable solution to the problem of normal church scarcity. These people watching Zahn online, particularly the less seasoned believers, need a permanent home. They need a pastor to love and disciple them. They need a church family to grow alongside them and hold them accountable. To this end, Zahn is trying to help the only way he knows how, by mentoring young preachers. He goes on, I had these 4 pastors in here yesterday from a fairly large church in Oregon. And I told them, you're going to have to lean into the great tradition. Don't allow your preaching to be driven by news cycles. Start paying attention to the Revised Common Lectionary. Preach from that. Pay attention to the liturgical calendar. Preach from that. Doesn't sound like a typical evangelical, I might say. It's not easy to break away from American traditions, Zahn said, but if evangelicals are to regain their lost standing, it is necessary. Christianity, again, is inherently countercultural. That's how it thrives. When it thrives to become a dominant culture, it becomes corrupted. That's been the case from the very beginning, Zahn says. Okay. If we are countercultural, and if the question that immediately comes up, what are we countercultural about? There are some places to turn, it seems to me. What does it mean to love the neighbor? Not just other Christians or Americans who look like us. What does it mean to be in the world, broadly speaking, but not of the world, let alone afraid of it? What does it mean to follow Christ? What does it mean to think the tradition, as Brian Zahn? You know what? I think that's a perfect response to what I just said. Let's growl at it. No, we're fine. Just what does it mean to share this planet both near and far with other religions? What does it mean to embrace change and to learn from the world about what it might mean to be faithful rather than simply resist the world at every turn? And so poignantly, at the moment, how do we live as Christians in the United States of America? In light of that question, when we gather now, 2 weeks from today, for the final section of this course, I'm going to step outside of Tim, Alberta a bit and raise a vocabulary issue, namely the word freedom. Freedom is so crucial to both Christian and American rhetoric. I'm going to use as our view into this world of freedom Timothy Snyder's book on freedom. Just came out not too many months ago. And Tim Freedom is a historian at Yale University, and his specialization, historically speaking, is Eastern Europe. But he has written this book on freedom. And I don't know much about Timothy Freedom's background. I think he grew up in Ohio, small town. And he opens his book, with an observation about how we think about freedom narrowly and negatively. Freedom from. He says we need to think about freedom to, or in our tradition, how we would describe it, freedom for. And he spends, I don't know, as good academics, we can spend hundreds of pages maybe describing the obvious. But that's where I want to go next time to kind of bring this to an end. And if that doesn't take us the whole hour, we will quit early, but it might be an opportunity to mull on some of these things over the next 2 weeks that we have been thinking about now for the last 4 Sundays, and we can have more discussion. I know I've done a lot of talking here, Richard.
At the beginning, you were talking about interactions of religion and politics. I'd like to share one from this last week. Okay, I got to read this because it's the wording is extraordinary. This is Trump's executive order defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. It doesn't really. Spoiler alert, yeah. This is his attempt to define the federal recognition of only 2 sexes, male and female, but the supposed biological definition gets the biology hysterically wrong. It says, female means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the large reproductive cell. Male means a person belonging at conception to the sex that produces the small reproductive cell. At conception, there's neither male nor female. Sexual differentiation doesn't happen until 6 to 7 weeks later when testosterone starts kicking in to create male characteristics. Without that, female characteristics develop. So by default, at conception, all humans are female. So welcome to the sisterhood, everybody. This also has an impact on his attempt to deny birthright citizenship for people born here who may not have parents who are citizens. It defines the father to be the immediate male progenitor of that person. But if there are only females, there are no male progenitors, so the order doesn't apply to anybody because nobody meets the qualifications for them. So this is where when you have, I'm not sure why they defined male and female this way, but it's probably because of the at conception is trying to, a religious point of view. Things can go very strangely.
Thank you. It's a good way to end today. Thanks, Richard. Okay, thanks for coming, folks. We'll see you in 2 weeks.